A racist bus driver demands that a black woman sit at the back of the bus and is enraged when she doesn't listen to him. He is shocked when the entire bus rises up against his racism. The city bus groaned to a halt on a busy downtown street, its doors hissing open. Commuters lined the sidewalk, bundled against the early morning chill. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a neatly dressed woman in her early 70s. Her posture was straight, her head held high, and her eyes sparkled with quiet determination. She clutched her purse tightly as she stepped aboard, nodding politely to the driver, Robert Whitman. Whitman barely looked at her. His scowl deepened as Evelyn dropped her coins into the fare box and paused to adjust her balance before moving forward. "Hurry it up!" he barked, his voice gravelly and impatient. Evelyn glanced at him briefly but said nothing, choosing instead to make her way toward an empty seat near the front of the bus. She grasped the pole and steadied herself as the bus jerked into motion, her eyes scanning the quiet faces around her. "Not there!" Whitman called out sharply, loud enough to cut through the silence. Evelyn stopped mid-step, turning slowly to face him. "Excuse me? You don't sit there. Seats up front aren't for you." Back of the bus. A hush fell over the passengers. A young woman near the window lowered her gaze, nervously pulling her toddler closer. An older man shifted uncomfortably, his newspaper suddenly fascinating. Evelyn's calm expression didn't falter. She took a measured step forward. "I've paid my fare," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'll sit where I please." Whitman slammed the brakes, the bus lurching violently. Passengers grabbed at poles and seats to steady themselves. The driver stood abruptly, pointing a finger at Evelyn. "You don't make the rules here, lady. Either you move to the back or you're off this bus. Your choice." The murmurs of the passengers grew louder, a mix of surprise and unease. A young man in the middle row pulled out his phone, the faint glow of its camera light visible as he began recording. Evelyn straightened her shoulders and met Whitman's glare. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Whitman's face reddened with fury. "We'll see about that." He grabbed the radio from his console and barked for transit security. The tension on the bus thickened as all eyes turned to Evelyn, waiting to see what would happen next. The bus remained idle on the crowded street, the low hum of its engine filling the tense silence. Evelyn Carter stood firm, her fingers lightly gripping the cold silver rail near the front seats. The passengers around her exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder as the confrontation dragged on. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Robert Whitman barked, stepping out from behind the driver's seat, his uniform stretched tightly over his broad shoulders, his face flushed with irritation. "Move to the back of the bus, or I'll have you removed." Evelyn looked up at him, her expression calm but unyielding. "I've done nothing wrong. I paid my fare. I'll sit where I please." Whitman's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You think you're special? I make the rules on this bus. If I tell you to move, you move." A murmur rippled through the passengers. A young mother near the front shifted uncomfortably, pulling her squirming toddler onto her lap. An older man in a suit adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed firmly out the window. A teenage girl whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This is ridiculous." Evelyn didn't raise her voice, but her words carried across the bus. "I'm not breaking any rules. What you're doing is wrong, and you know it." The driver's face twisted in fury. "You don't get to tell me what's right. You're disturbing everyone else here. People are trying to get to work." He gestured broadly at the passengers, as if expecting their agreement. The majority remained silent, avoiding eye contact. From the middle of the bus, a young man with earbuds dangling from his ears raised his phone slightly, the faint red light of a recording visible. "You're the one holding us up, man," he said loudly. "She's just trying to sit." Whitman turned his glare on the young man. "Stay out of it. This isn't your concern." The young man leaned back, undeterred, and kept filming. The bus jerked slightly as Whitman stomped back to his seat and grabbed the radio. His voice crackled through the speaker as he called in his complaint. "Dispatch! This is Route 23. I have a passenger refusing to comply, requesting transit security at my location." The murmurs of the passengers grew louder. "She's not doing anything wrong," a woman near the back muttered, her voice barely audible. Why's he making such a fuss? Evelyn turned to face the other passengers, her gaze sweeping across their hesitant faces. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. It's about what's right. Spare us the speech, Whitman snapped, cutting her off. You're off this bus the second security gets here. A little boy sitting with his mother tugged on her sleeve. Why's the driver yelling at her, Mommy? He asked in a loud whisper. The mother hushed him quickly, glancing nervously at Whitman. Evelyn smiled gently at the child. Sometimes people don't like being challenged when they know they're wrong, she said softly. Don't talk to him, Whitman barked, his voice booming. His frustration seemed to grow with every passing moment. The passengers flinched as his outburst echoed through the bus. The young man with the phone spoke up again, his voice steady. You're digging yourself into a hole, man. Everyone's gonna see this. Whitman glared at him, but said nothing, his jaw tightening. The faint sound of a siren began to pierce the tense atmosphere, signaling the arrival of transit security. Evelyn didn't move, her calm, steady presence standing in stark contrast to the chaos Whitman seemed determined to create. The passengers fell silent, their eyes darting between Evelyn and the driver. The bus door hissed open as Whitman prepared for the arrival of the officers. Evelyn remained poised, her shoulders back, and her chin held high. We'll see what they have to say, she said quietly, her words filled with quiet defiance. As the sound of the siren grew louder, the tension on the bus reached its breaking point. Everyone waited, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy, unrelenting tide. The siren's wail grew louder, cutting through the uneasy silence inside the bus. Evelyn Carter stood firm, her hand still resting on the silver rail. Robert Whitman returned to his seat, but kept shooting glances at her, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. The other passengers murmured quietly among themselves, the tension thick enough to weigh down the already stale air. A young mother with a toddler, seated a few rows back, finally broke the silence. Why doesn't she just move? She muttered under her breath, though her words carried enough weight to be heard. This is holding everyone up. I would have moved, the man next to her chimed in, his voice low but tinged with irritation. Not worth the fight. Evelyn turned her head slightly in their direction. Some fights are worth it, she said simply, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. She met the mother's gaze briefly, before returning her focus to the front of the bus. The young man with the phone recording leaned forward. She's got a point. Why's he even bothering her in the first place? There's nothing wrong with sitting up front. Whitman shot him a sharp glare, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Stay in your lane, kid. This doesn't concern you, doesn't it? The man shot back, his tone steady. You're making it everyone's business by stopping the bus. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably. A teenage girl sitting a few rows ahead of Evelyn whispered to the woman beside her, I can't believe this is happening. It's like something out of a history book. Yeah, the woman replied, her voice low, but it's not history. It's now. The faint sound of footsteps approached as the siren's wail tapered off. Transit security was here. The bus door hissed open, and two officers stepped on board, their dark uniforms standing out against the bright morning sunlight streaming in through the windows. Whitman was on his feet instantly. Finally, she's been refusing to comply, he said, jabbing a finger in Evelyn's direction, holding up the bus, and causing a scene. The officers turned their attention to Evelyn, their faces neutral. Ma'am, one of them began, his tone measured. We've been called because you're refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you tell us what's going on? Evelyn held her ground, her voice calm but unwavering. I paid my fare like everyone else here. He demanded I move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his own prejudice. That's not true, Whitman interjected, his voice rising. I told her these seats are priority seats. She doesn't belong here. Priority for who? Evelyn countered, her gaze sharp. The elderly? I certainly qualify. Or are there other criteria I'm unaware of? The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The other passengers watched intently, a few nodding at Evelyn's words. The young man with the phone tilted it slightly, making sure to catch the officers, Whitman and Evelyn, all in frame. Ma'am, The easiest thing would be to move to another seat, the second officer said, his tone placating. We're just trying to resolve this without further delay. I'm not the one delaying the bus, Evelyn replied. He is. If I step off now, he'll think he can keep treating people this way. And he'll be right. The teenage girl who had whispered earlier suddenly stood up. She's right, she said loudly, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. Why should she have to move? He's the one being a jerk. Sit down, Whitman barked, his frustration boiling over. You want to get thrown off too? That's enough, the first officer said sharply, holding up a hand to calm the driver. Sir, we'll handle this, the young man with the phone spoke up again, his tone defiant. Everyone's already seen what you're doing, man. This video's gonna be everywhere by tonight. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A man in a suit near the back of the bus, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Look, this is ridiculous. She hasn't done anything wrong. Just let her stay where she is, and we can all get moving. Whitman's face turned a deeper shade of red, his hands clenching into fists. You people don't get it. Rules are rules. You can't just let anyone sit up here. Anyone? Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the chaos. Or just people who look like me? The bus fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware of the tension. Outside, pedestrians began to gather near the bus, curious about the commotion. The young man with the phone turned his camera toward the crowd, capturing their growing interest. We need to make a decision, the second officer said, his voice tight. Ma'am, are you willing to step off the bus so we can de-escalate the situation? Evelyn straightened her shoulders, her expression unyielding. No, I've done nothing wrong, and I won't be treated like this. Not today. The officers hesitated, their authority caught between the calm defiance of an elderly woman and the fiery tension of an increasingly agitated bus driver. Whitman shook his head, muttering under his breath as he returned to his seat. The atmosphere in the bus was electric, every passenger on edge as the standoff continued. Outside, more people gathered, their murmurs joining the faint sounds of car horns and distant chatter. Evelyn didn't move, her quiet dignity speaking louder than any argument could. She was a pillar of resolve in the chaos, refusing to back down from the injustice thrust upon her. The crowd outside the bus grew larger, their curious murmurs floating through the open doors. Inside, the atmosphere simmered with tension. Evelyn remained steady, her posture unyielding as the officers exchanged looks. Unsure how to proceed, passengers shifted in their seats, the unease palpable. One of the officers sighed and turned back to Whitman. Sir, what exactly are you asking us to do here? She's not being aggressive or posing a threat? Whitman threw up his hands in frustration. Are you serious? She's refusing to follow instructions. I can't do my job with someone like her up here disrupting everything. A young woman near the middle of the bus, her voice quivering but defiant, called out, You're the one making the scene, not her. Several passengers murmured in agreement. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood up again, her hands clutching the edge of the seat for balance. Yeah, she's just sitting there. What's the big deal? Whitman's glare shot toward her. You want me to throw you off too? Sit down and stay out of it. The officer raised a hand to calm him. Let's keep this civil, he said, his voice firm but tired. He turned back to Evelyn. Ma'am, are you sure you won't consider just moving to another seat? It might make things easier for everyone. Evelyn's gaze never wavered. I've done nothing wrong. If I move, it will be easier for him, not everyone. And I won't give him the satisfaction. The tension was broken by the sound of a phone chiming loudly. The young man who had been recording the incident smirked and held up his phone. Looks like it's already online. Over 1,000 views in 5 minutes. Whitman's face darkened, his jaw clenching as his anger threatened to boil over. You put this on the internet? He growled, his voice low but menacing. Damn right I did, the young man replied, undeterred. People need to see this. You can't treat people like this and think you'll get away with it. A ripple of approval moved through the passengers. Even those who had been silent now murmured their agreement. The man in the suit near the back spoke up, his voice calm but sharp. This isn't 1955. She has every right to sit where she wants. Whitman slammed his fist onto the dashboard, the loud thud silencing the murmurs. "I've had it," he shouted. "She's off this bus, or we're not going anywhere." The officers stiffened at his tone, their own patience wearing thin. The first officer stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Sir, if you keep escalating this, you're going to be the one facing consequences. You've called us here to handle the situation, so let us do our job." Outside, the crowd began to grow louder. People pressed closer to the bus, some raising their phones to record the scene. A man in a construction vest called out, "What's going on in there? Why isn't the bus moving?" "Driver's being a racist jerk!" someone yelled from the back of the bus, drawing laughter and cheers from the gathering crowd. The second officer rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the pressure. He turned back to Evelyn, his tone softer but still urging. "Ma'am, I understand your position, and I don't blame you. But this is getting bigger by the minute. Are you sure you want to keep this going?" Evelyn glanced at the crowd outside, their faces a mix of curiosity and growing outrage. Her eyes swept over the passengers, some watching her with sympathy, others with exasperation. Finally, she looked at the young man recording the incident and gave him a small nod. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me. It's about what's right." The officer straightened, nodding in reluctant acknowledgement. "All right, ma'am. Then we'll stay until we can resolve this properly." Whitman let out a derisive laugh. "You're just going to let her get away with this? Unbelievable!" The officer turned sharply toward him. "One more outburst, and I'll have you reported for misconduct." The driver fell silent, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The tension in the bus was electric, every passenger hanging on the edge of their seats. Outside, the crowd grew louder, their voices forming a faint chant that reached the ears of everyone on board. "Let her sit! Let her sit!" Evelyn finally took her seat near the front, her head held high. Her quiet defiance seemed to radiate strength, a stark contrast to Whitman's growing agitation. The officers exchanged a final glance before stepping outside to address the crowd, leaving the driver fuming and the passengers buzzing with murmurs of approval. The young man with the phone grinned, lowering it briefly to address Evelyn. "You're a legend, ma'am. This video's gonna blow up." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, but said nothing, her focus still on Whitman. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the tide seemed to be turning in her favor. The officers stepped off the bus, the weight of the growing crowd pressing down on the tension already simmering inside. The chant outside had grown louder, the rhythmic, "Let her sit! Let her sit!" echoing through the open doors. Passengers exchanged glances, their unease now mingling with curiosity. Evelyn sat poised, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the windshield ahead. She could feel Whitman's glare boring into her from his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The young man with the phone held it up again, panning across the passengers to capture their reactions. "You see this?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is what standing up looks like. Y'all better remember her face, because she's making history right now." Whitman snapped his head toward the young man. "Turn that damn thing off. You're disrupting this bus just as much as she is." The young man smirked. "Disrupting? Nah, I'm documenting. There's a difference." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a worn leather bag, spoke up for the first time. "Honestly, we should all be documenting this. He's treating her like garbage for no reason." Whitman turned his attention to her, his anger spilling over. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about. I've been driving this route for years, and I know how to handle troublemakers." "Troublemaker?" the teenage girl from earlier shot back, standing again despite the driver's earlier threats. "She's literally just sitting there. How's that trouble?" "You all want to play hero, huh?" Whitman barked, his voice rising. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this bus doesn't move." From the back of the bus, a man in a suit stood, his face calm, but his voice firm. "We've all been sitting here long enough. If you can't handle this professionally, maybe you shouldn't be driving." Whitman's face turned crimson. "You think you can do my job better, pal? Be my guest. Maybe I would, if it meant treating people like humans." the man retorted, sitting back down as murmurs of agreement rippled through the bus. Outside, the chants grew louder, joined by the occasional car horn as drivers slowed to observe the commotion. The officers stood by the door, trying to manage the swelling crowd. A reporter with a camera pushed her way to the front, the red recording light visible through the bus's grimy window. Whitman, now visibly rattled, grabbed the radio again. "Dispatch, this is Route 23. Situation's getting worse. There's a crowd outside now. We need more officers." The radio crackled in response. "Additional units are en route. Hold tight." Evelyn let out a quiet breath, her composure never wavering. She glanced at the young man still filming. "You should focus on what's happening outside, too," she said softly. "This is bigger than just this bus." He nodded and angled his phone toward the crowd, capturing the chants and the faces of those demanding justice. "You're right," he said, "but you're still the star here." Whitman slammed his hand onto the dashboard, the sound startling some of the passengers. "Enough! I'm sick of this circus. Everyone who has a problem with me, get off my bus right now." No one moved. The teenage girl crossed her arms defiantly. The man in the suit stared out the window, and the young mother clutched her child tighter, but stayed silent. Even those who had been reluctant earlier now seemed rooted to their seats, their quiet solidarity a stark rebuke to the driver's outburst. Evelyn turned her head slowly to look at Whitman. Her voice was low, but carried through the bus. "You don't get to decide who belongs here. That's not your job." Whitman's mouth opened as if to retort, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. The chants outside were growing louder, the crowd swelling into a small sea of people. Phones and cameras pointed toward the bus, capturing every moment. One of the officers re-entered the bus, his face tight with frustration. "Driver," he said firmly, "we need to de-escalate this now. The crowd's growing, and the media's here. This situation is out of control." Whitman scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Oh, so now it's my fault? I told you how to handle this. Get her off the bus." The officer shook his head. "No, if we try to force her off now, we're going to have a bigger problem on our hands. The crowd's not on your side." Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. She turned her attention back to the window, where signs had begun to appear in the crowd. One read, "Justice for Evelyn." Another, scrawled hastily on cardboard, simply said, "End the hate." Whitman sank into his seat, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. Evelyn remained calm, her presence unshaken. The energy in the bus shifted. The passengers no longer felt like mere observers. They were witnesses to something bigger than a morning commute. The officer turned to Evelyn, his voice softer. "Ma'am, we're working on resolving this. Just stay seated." She nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "I wasn't planning on moving." The officer exited the bus again, and Whitman sat in smoldering silence. The noise from the crowd outside was now deafening, a chorus of voices calling for justice. Inside the bus, the passengers seemed to sit a little straighter, their nervous energy replaced by quiet resolve. The world was watching, and Evelyn Carter was at the center of it all. The officer's voice crackled from his radio outside, trying to manage the growing crowd. Inside the bus, the tension had reached a breaking point. Whitman sat stiffly in his seat, glaring at Evelyn. His fingers tapped impatiently against the steering wheel, each motion sharper than the last. Evelyn remained composed, her chin high as she stared out the window at the sea of faces demanding justice. The chants outside, "Let her sit," echoed louder, reverberating through the walls of the bus. "You think you're some kind of hero," Whitman growled, his voice barely contained. He stood abruptly, his chair creaking from the force. "You're not. You're just another troublemaker making my life harder." Evelyn didn't flinch, her calm demeanor amplifying his anger. "What I am," she said, her voice steady, "is someone who's tired of being pushed around. If you can't handle that, maybe you're in the wrong job." His face flushed crimson. "That's it. I'm done playing nice." He stalked toward her, the veins in his neck pulsing with barely restrained rage. The passengers gasped. Several shouted in protest. "What are you doing?" the teenage girl cried, standing halfway up in her seat. "You can't do that! Don't touch her!" yelled the young man with the phone, angling his camera to capture Whitman's every move. Whitman ignored them all, his focus solely on Evelyn. He loomed over her, his large frame blocking out the light from the windows. "I told you to get off my bus," he snarled, "and if you won't do it yourself, I'll make you." Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "You lay one finger on me, and you'll regret it." The warning didn't deter him. Whitman grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her halfway out of the seat. The passengers erupted in outrage, several leaping to their feet. "Stop him!" someone shouted. The young man recording bolted forward, his phone still trained on the scene. "Let her go!" he yelled. But Whitman shoved him back with his free hand, sending him stumbling into another seat. Evelyn winced but refused to cry out, her resolve unshaken even as Whitman dragged her farther from her seat. "This is assault," she said firmly. "You're not above the law, no matter what you think." The doors of the bus slammed open, and the officers charged back inside. "Stop right now!" one of them barked, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. "Driver, let her go." Whitman froze but didn't release her immediately. His head whipped toward the officers, his anger now mixed with defiance. "She's disrupting my bus. I'm just doing my job." "That's not your job," the officer snapped, stepping forward. "And if you don't let her go this second, you're going to be in cuffs." Whitman hesitated for a fraction of a second before releasing Evelyn's arm. She settled back into her seat, her composure still intact despite the ordeal. The officer turned to her, concern flashing across his face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Evelyn said, smoothing her sleeve. Her voice was steady, but her eyes remained fixed on Whitman. "But he isn't." The second officer stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting in the light. "Driver, you're under arrest for assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Whitman roared, his voice echoing through the bus. "You can't be serious. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore," the officer replied coldly. He grabbed Whitman's arm and spun him around, locking the cuffs into place. Whitman struggled, but the officer's grip was firm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The passengers watched in stunned silence as Whitman was marched down the aisle, his protests drowned out by the chants from outside. "This is ridiculous," he yelled, craning his neck to glare at Evelyn. "You'll regret this, lady." Evelyn finally broke her silence, her voice calm but cutting. "I think the only one with regrets here will be you." The officer guided Whitman down the bus steps and into the arms of the growing crowd, where cameras and phones flashed in every direction. The reporter outside shouted questions as Whitman was loaded into a waiting police car, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. Inside the bus, the passengers erupted into applause. The teenage girl clapped loudly, her grin wide. "Finally, some justice," she exclaimed. The young man with the phone turned back to Evelyn, still recording. "Ma'am, that was incredible. Everyone's gonna see this." Evelyn gave him a faint smile, her composure softening for the first time. "Good. Maybe it'll make people think twice about staying silent." The officer who had arrested Whitman stepped back onto the bus, addressing Evelyn directly. "Ma'am, we're going to make sure this gets properly documented. Do you want to press charges?" Evelyn nodded firmly. "Absolutely." The officer tipped his hat slightly. "We'll handle the rest from here. You just sit tight." As the officer exited again, the crowd outside cheered, their chants shifting to her name. Evelyn Carter had become the face of defiance, a quiet but powerful figure standing tall against injustice. The bus doors closed, and the replacement driver, a young woman with kind eyes, climbed aboard. She glanced at Evelyn and smiled. "Where to next?" she asked, her tone light but respectful. Evelyn relaxed into her seat, her shoulders finally easing. "Forward," she said simply. The police cruiser carrying Robert Whitman sped away from the scene, its sirens wailing faintly as it disappeared down the street. The crowd outside the bus erupted into cheers and applause, their voices echoing in unison. Inside, the energy shifted. The passengers, who had been wary and hesitant before, now buzzed with a mix of relief and triumph. Evelyn Carter remained seated at the front, her posture as poised as ever. She rubbed her arm where Whitman had grabbed her, her hand lingering briefly before returning to her lap. The young man with the phone moved closer, his recording still running. "Ma'am, you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than before. The defiance he'd shown to Whitman had given way to genuine concern. "I'm fine," Evelyn replied, her voice steady. She met his gaze, her tone carrying a quiet strength. "It'll take more than that to shake me." The teenage girl stepped forward, clutching her backpack against her chest. "You were amazing," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." "It wasn't just for me," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping across the other passengers. "Sometimes you have to take a stand, even if it's uncomfortable." Her words seemed to resonate. The man in the suit, who had remained quiet for much of the ordeal, finally spoke up. "You've got more courage than most people, Mrs. Carter," she said with a small nod. "Evelyn Carter." "Well, Mrs. Carter," he continued, "you've inspired all of us today." That man deserved everything he got. The young mother, still holding her child tightly, leaned forward from her seat. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner," she admitted, her voice tinged with guilt. I didn't want to make things worse." Evelyn offered her a kind smile. "It's never easy, especially when fear takes over. But every voice matters. Remember that next time." The young man holding the phone interrupted, turning his screen toward Evelyn. "Your video's already blowing up. I just checked. Tens of thousands of views. People are sharing it everywhere." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, the corner of her lips curling slightly. "Well," she said, "it seems the truth has its way of getting out." Before anyone could respond, the replacement driver, a petite woman with a calm, authoritative demeanor, stepped onto the bus. She adjusted her uniform cap and scanned the faces in the aisle, her expression professional yet kind. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "I'll be taking over for the rest of the route. Sorry for the delay, folks." She glanced at Evelyn, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked, her tone respectful. Evelyn inclined her head. "Yes? I just want to say thank you," the driver said. "What you did today, it's not just for you. It's for all of us." The bus fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Evelyn nodded, her gratitude unspoken but evident in her expression. The driver returned to her seat, and the bus hummed to life again, finally moving forward. As they continued their route, the passengers began talking among themselves, sharing their perspectives on what had happened. Some debated how Whitman had kept his job for so long, while others expressed outrage at the system that had allowed his behavior to persist. Evelyn listened quietly, her presence a steady anchor amid the buzz of voices. The young man with the phone eventually sat beside her, lowering his camera for the first time. "What happens next?" he asked. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I press charges," she said firmly, "and then we see where the fight takes us." He nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people are going to want to help. Your video, it's bigger than just this bus." "It has to be," Evelyn replied. "Change doesn't come from silence." The teenage girl, now sitting across from them, leaned forward. "Do you think they'll fire him for good?" Evelyn's lips tightened briefly. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever happens to him, I'll make sure people see what he stood for. That's what matters." The bus pulled up to the next stop, and a handful of passengers disembarked. Outside, the crowd had thinned slightly, but a few people remained, waving their signs and cheering as Evelyn glanced at them through the window. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, a subtle but powerful gesture that drew another wave of applause. As the bus moved on, Evelyn felt a sense of resolve settle over her. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew that much. But for the first time, she felt that the voices around her, once silent, had found strength, and that was a victory in itself. The aftermath of the bus altercation spread rapidly. By the next day, Evelyn Carter's name was on everyone's lips. The video taken by the young passenger went viral, garnering millions of views across social media. News stations picked up the story, replaying the footage of Robert Whitman dragging Evelyn from her seat, followed by his subsequent arrest. Public outrage ignited like wildfire, with protests forming outside the city's transit headquarters and hashtags like Chak Justice for Evelyn and Ashanj End Transit Racism trending worldwide. Evelyn, however, remained composed as the storm unfolded. She sat in her modest living room, her phone buzzing constantly with calls, texts, and notifications. Reporters clamored for interviews, and activists reached out with offers of support. Despite the noise, Evelyn focused on the next step, holding Whitman and the Transit Authority accountable. Her lawyer, Angela Martin, arrived at Evelyn's home that afternoon, her presence exuding a quiet authority. Angela, a sharp-dressed civil rights attorney in her mid-30s, had reached out after seeing the video. Now, she spread out documents across Evelyn's coffee table, her expression both determined and grim. "This case is bigger than just one man," Angela said, pointing to a file labeled Transit Authority Misconduct Complaints. Whitman has a history of complaints, racial profiling, verbal abuse, but the Transit Authority has always swept them under the rug. They protected him. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then it's not just him we need to hold accountable. It's the system that allowed him to get away with it. Exactly, Angela replied, her eyes lighting up with approval. We're not just going after Whitman for assault. We're going after the Transit Authority for negligence and fostering a culture of discrimination. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Do you think we can win? Angela's gaze was unwavering. With the public on our side? Yes. But it won't be easy. The Transit Authority is already circling the wagons. They'll try to discredit you, make this about something else. Evelyn's lips tightened. They can try, but the truth is out there. People saw what happened. Angela nodded. And that's why we'll use every bit of evidence we have. The video, witness statements, Whitman's arrest. It all builds a strong case. But we'll need you to testify. Evelyn's eyes flickered with resolve. I'll do whatever it takes. In the days that followed, Evelyn and Angela worked tirelessly to prepare for the trial. Witnesses from the bus began coming forward, their statements painting a damning picture of Whitman's behavior. The teenage girl who had spoken up during the altercation gave a powerful account of what she had seen. The young man who had recorded the video provided not just his footage, but also his testimony, emphasizing how Whitman's aggression had escalated unprovoked. Even passengers who had initially remained silent began to step forward, emboldened by Evelyn's courage. One middle-aged woman, who had been hesitant to speak up during the incident, admitted to Angela during a meeting, "I've seen him treat other people like that before. I always thought it wasn't my place to say anything, but now I see how wrong I was." As the trial date approached, the Transit Authority released a carefully worded statement. They expressed regret over the incident and promised to review policies to ensure fairness and inclusivity. The statement, however, fell flat. Activists and community leaders lambasted it as hollow, demanding more tangible action. Meanwhile, Whitman's lawyer took a different approach, claiming his client had been provoked. Mr. Whitman was simply enforcing the rules to maintain order on his bus, the lawyer said during a press conference. This situation has been blown out of proportion by a viral video that doesn't tell the whole story. Evelyn watched the broadcast with Angela, her jaw tightening. Enforcing the rules, she repeated, her voice edged with disbelief. They really think anyone's going to believe that? Angela smirked grimly. They're desperate, and it shows. That's good for us. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with activity. Protesters filled the steps outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for Evelyn and accountability now." Reporters clustered by the entrance, their cameras flashing as Evelyn arrived with Angela by her side. Evelyn held her head high as she walked up the steps, her presence commanding respect. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting her name as she passed. Angela placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this," she said. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Whitman sat at the defendant's table, his expression a mix of defiance and discomfort. His lawyer leaned over, whispering in his ear, but he didn't look up. Evelyn took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. As the judge entered and the trial began, Angela rose for her opening statement. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she addressed the jury. "This case isn't just about an assault on a city bus," she began. "It's about a pattern of abuse and discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long." My client, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, stood up, not just for herself, but for every person who has been silenced by injustice. "Today, we ask you to hold Mr. Whitman and the Transit Authority accountable for their actions." Evelyn glanced at the jury, seeing their rapt attention. This was just the beginning, but she knew they had a strong case. The fight was far from over, but the truth was on their side. The courtroom quieted as the first witness took the stand. A middle-aged woman who had been seated near the back of the bus during the incident. Her hands fidgeted nervously as she answered Angela Martin's questions, but her words were clear. "I saw everything," the woman said. "Mrs. Carter just wanted to sit down. She wasn't bothering anyone. It was the driver who started yelling at her." Angela nodded, her tone encouraging but professional. "And how would you describe his tone?" The witness hesitated, glancing at the defendant's table where Whitman sat stiffly. "It was loud, aggressive, like he wanted to make her feel small." "And did you feel his behavior was justified?" "Not at all," the woman said firmly. "He was out of line. It was embarrassing to watch." Angela smiled faintly. "Thank you. No further questions." The defense attorney stood next, his expression sharp and calculating. He approached the witness slowly, as though preparing to dismantle her testimony piece by piece. "Ma'am, you mentioned feeling embarrassed. Isn't it true that your embarrassment could have colored your perception of my client's actions?" The woman frowned, clearly caught off guard. I don't think so." "You don't think so," he repeated, his tone bordering on condescension. "But isn't it possible that you interpreted his tone as aggressive because of your own discomfort with the situation?" Angela rose. "Objection, Your Honor." Leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said, casting a warning glance at the defense attorney. "Move on." The defense attorney stepped back, feigning disappointment. "No further questions." The next witness was the teenage girl who had stood up for Evelyn during the altercation. Her youthful energy was now replaced with nervous determination as she recounted the events of that day. "I saw him grab her," the girl said, her voice trembling slightly. "She didn't do anything to deserve that." Angela approached her with a reassuring smile. "You spoke up during the incident, didn't you?" "Yes," the girl replied. "I told him he couldn't treat her like that." "And how did he respond?" "He yelled at me to sit down and stay out of it," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But I couldn't. It wasn't right." Angela nodded, her tone warm. "You showed courage that day. Thank you for speaking out." The defense attorney tried to rattle her, focusing on her youth and suggesting she might have been too inexperienced to understand the nuances of the situation. But the girl's resolve held firm, her answers concise and unwavering. The most compelling moment came when the young man with the phone took the stand. He provided not only his video evidence, but also his first-hand account of Whitman's escalating aggression. "He grabbed her," the young man said, his voice firm. "No one provoked him. He just lost it." Angela played the video for the court, the footage capturing every moment of the altercation in vivid detail. The sound of Whitman yelling, the gasps of the passengers, and the chants of the crowd outside echoed through the courtroom. By the time the video ended, the jury's expressions were solemn. Angela turned to the young man. "Why did you record this incident?" "Because I've seen stuff like this happen before," he said. "People get away with it because no one speaks up. I wanted to make sure this time was different." Angela nodded. "And do you feel it was different?" He glanced at Evelyn, a small smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. "Yeah, Mrs. Carter made it different." The defense attempted to cast doubt on the video, suggesting it might not show the full context of the situation. But the jury's reaction made it clear that the footage had left a lasting impression. When Evelyn herself took the stand, The courtroom fell silent. She was the picture of composure, her voice calm but filled with quiet strength as she recounted her experience. "I paid my fare like everyone else," she said. "I just wanted to sit down, but the moment I did, he decided I didn't belong there." Angela's voice was soft as she asked, "Why didn't you move to the back of the bus when he told you to?" Evelyn paused, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "Because it wasn't about the seat. It was about dignity. If I had moved, I would have been saying that his actions were acceptable. And they weren't." The jury hung on her every word. Even Whitman, who had spent much of the trial avoiding her gaze, now seemed unable to look away. Angela stepped closer. "What do you hope to achieve with this case?" Evelyn's voice grew stronger. "Accountability. Not just for Mr. Whitman, but for the system that allowed him to act this way for so long. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." The room was silent as Angela nodded. No further questions. The defense's cross-examination was pointed, but failed to shake Evelyn's composure. She countered every question with poise, her responses firm and unwavering. By the time she stepped down, it was clear her testimony had made a powerful impact. The trial was far from over, but Evelyn had set the tone. The truth was out, and the fight for justice was in full swing. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the defense prepared to present their case. Robert Whitman, looking more deflated than defiant, was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie nervously and avoided eye contact with Evelyn as he took his seat. Whitman's attorney began with a series of carefully framed questions designed to cast his actions in a more sympathetic light. "Mr. Whitman," the lawyer began, his voice smooth, "can you explain your perspective on the events of that day?" Whitman cleared his throat, his voice shaky but firm. "I was just trying to do my job," he said. "The front seats are priority seats. I told her to move because that's the rule. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just enforcing policy. And when Mrs. Carter refused to comply," the lawyer pressed, "I gave her chances to move." Whitman replied, his tone growing defensive. "I tried to keep things under control, but she wouldn't listen. It created a scene, and I had to act." Angela Martin's eyes narrowed as she scribbled notes. Her turn would come soon enough. "Do you believe you acted reasonably in the moment?" the lawyer continued. Whitman nodded. "Yes, I was following protocol." The defense lawyer turned to the jury, gesturing toward his client. Mr. Whitman was put in a difficult situation. As a bus driver, his priority is the safety and efficiency of his route. When someone disrupts that, he has to act quickly. Angela rose from her seat. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is testifying." "Sustained," the judge replied. "Counselor, stick to questioning." The defense lawyer nodded smoothly, refocusing on Whitman. "Would you say your actions were in any way motivated by Mrs. Carter's race?" Whitman's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. I treat all my passengers the same." When Angela approached the stand for cross-examination, her steps were deliberate, her demeanor calm yet commanding. She stood a moment in silence, letting the weight of the courtroom settle before speaking. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice measured, "you say you treat all passengers the same. Is that correct?" "Yes," Whitman replied, his tone clipped. Angela nodded, flipping through a file. "Then, can you explain why, over the past 5 years, you've received multiple complaints, 5 of which explicitly referenced discriminatory behavior?" Whitman stiffened. "Those complaints were exaggerated." "Exaggerated," Angela repeated, her tone neutral. "So the passengers who accused you of racial profiling were lying?" "I didn't say that," Whitman snapped. "I said they exaggerated." Angela approached the jury, holding up a stack of documents. "Let me remind the court that these are official complaints filed with the Transit Authority, each one detailing incidents similar to what happened to Mrs. Carter. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Whitman's lawyer interjected. "Objection! Relevance." "Your Honor," Angela countered, "this speaks directly to Mr. Whitman's pattern of behavior and his credibility as a witness." The judge considered for a moment before nodding. "Overruled. Proceed." Angela turned back to Whitman. Let's focus on one particular complaint from last year. A passenger reported that you asked them to move to the back of the bus despite plenty of empty seats. Do you recall this incident? No, Whitman said flatly. Angela raised an eyebrow. You don't recall it, or you don't want to recall it? Objection! The defense lawyer called out. Sustained, the judge said. But the damage was done. The jury shifted in their seats, their expressions increasingly skeptical. Angela moved closer to the witness stand, her voice sharpening. Mr. Whitman, isn't it true that the only protocol you were enforcing that day was your own prejudice? That's not true, Whitman shot back, his voice rising. Angela held his gaze, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to his outburst. The video shows you grabbing Mrs. Carter. She was seated quietly, posing no threat. Explain to the court how that aligns with your so-called protocol. Whitman faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. She refused to listen. I lost my temper, Angela pounced. You lost your temper? So it wasn't about protocol, was it? It was about your inability to handle a passenger who dared to stand up to you. Whitman's lawyer leapt to his feet. Objection! Argumentative! The judge nodded. Sustained. Angela stepped back slightly, her expression calm. No further questions, Your Honor. As Whitman returned to his seat, his face was pale, his earlier bravado shattered. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the jury exchanging meaningful glances. The defense attempted to redirect focus by calling a transit authority representative to testify. The official gave a carefully rehearsed statement, emphasizing their commitment to fairness and equality. But Angela was ready. Is it true, she asked during cross-examination, that Mr. Whitman received sensitivity training after his third misconduct complaint? The official hesitated. Yes, that's correct. And yet, he continued to receive complaints, didn't he? The official's shoulders slumped. Yes, Angela's voice grew sharper. So what measures, if any, did the transit authority take to address these ongoing issues? We followed policy, the official stammered. We investigated each complaint. Angela turned to the jury. And yet Mr. Whitman was allowed to continue driving, unchecked, until his actions were caught on camera. Is that what you call accountability? The official didn't respond. As the day ended, Angela's cross-examinations had exposed not only Whitman's behavior, but also the systemic failures that enabled him. The tide of the trial was shifting, and Evelyn could feel it. As she walked out of the courtroom with Angela by her side, the crowd outside erupted into cheers once again. The truth was emerging, piece by piece, and justice felt closer than ever. The courtroom was silent as both sides prepared for closing arguments. The tension was palpable. Every eye focused on the attorneys standing at their respective tables. Evelyn Carter sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her composure unshaken, though her hands rested tightly together in her lap. Angela Martin rose first, her movements deliberate as she approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Angela began, her voice firm but measured, you've heard the testimony. You've seen the video. This case is not complicated. Robert Whitman assaulted Mrs. Evelyn Carter not because she broke any rules, but because she refused to bend to his prejudice. She gestured toward Evelyn. Mrs. Carter paid her fare. She followed every posted guideline, yet she was singled out, berated, humiliated, and physically removed from her seat. Why? Because Mr. Whitman saw someone he thought he could overpower, someone whose dignity he thought didn't matter. Angela stepped closer to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces. This isn't just about one bus ride. It's about a system that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked for years. The transit authority knew about Mr. Whitman's history. They knew he had complaints. And they did nothing. By ignoring the problem, they enabled it. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But today, you have the power to send a message, to tell Mr. Whitman, the transit authority, and the community that this behavior is not acceptable, that no one, regardless of their race, age, or status, deserves to be treated like this. Angela turned to Evelyn, her voice softening. Mrs. Carter could have stayed silent. She could have let this moment pass. But she chose to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. She chose courage over comfort, and she deserves justice. The courtroom was silent as Angela returned to her seat. The defense attorney stood, his expression carefully controlled. "Members of the jury," he began, "my client, Robert Whitman, did not act out of malice. He was enforcing policies designed to maintain order and safety on public transit. Mrs. Carter's refusal to comply escalated the situation. My client regrets his actions, but they were not rooted in prejudice." His tone shifted, more pleading than persuasive. "We ask you to consider the full context of the incident, and to understand that Mr. Whitman is not a villain. He is a man who made a mistake in a high-pressure situation." The defense attorney returned to his seat quickly, his argument noticeably lacking the passion and conviction of Angela's. The jury deliberated for several hours, the weight of the case evident in their furrowed brows and hushed conversations. Evelyn waited patiently in the courtroom, her hands folded neatly on the table. Angela sat beside her, her calm demeanor masking the intensity of her focus. When the jury finally returned, the room held its breath. The foreperson rose, holding a small slip of paper. "In the matter of Carter versus Whitman and the Transit Authority," she began, "we find the defendant, Robert Whitman, guilty of assault and misconduct." The words sent a wave of emotion through the room. Evelyn's eyes closed briefly, a mixture of relief and quiet triumph washing over her. The foreperson continued, "We also find the Transit Authority liable for negligence in failing to address repeated complaints against Mr. Whitman." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the weight of the verdict sinking in. The judge thanked the jury and announced sentencing would follow in the coming weeks. For now, justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as news of the verdict spread. Protesters held up signs reading, "Justice for Evelyn and accountability now," their voices echoing across the courthouse steps. Evelyn stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Angela and a small group of supporters. Reporters crowded around her, microphones and cameras jostling for space. "Mrs. Carter, how do you feel about the verdict?" one called out. Evelyn paused, her voice steady but emotional. "I feel grateful," she said, "not just for myself, but for everyone who stood with me. This isn't just my victory. It's ours, and it's proof that standing up for what's right can make a difference." Angela stepped in, adding, "This case sends a clear message. No one is above accountability, and no one should have to endure discrimination. Today, justice prevailed. But the work doesn't end here." The crowd cheered louder as Evelyn raised her hand in a subtle wave. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the movement she had sparked. In the weeks that followed, the Transit Authority announced sweeping reforms, including mandatory anti-bias training for all employees and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to address misconduct. Robert Whitman was sentenced to community service and ordered to attend anger management classes, his career as a bus driver effectively over. Evelyn returned to her quiet life, though she often found herself at the center of community events and discussions about systemic change. She spoke at schools, community centers, and forums, her story becoming a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up for justice. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "We did it. Thank you for trusting me." Evelyn smiled softly, her heart full. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth every moment. She had stood her ground, and the world was better for it.